This isn't just a story. This is a reminder that God still moves. If you're looking for direction, comfort, or simply a sign that He hears you, subscribe now and walk with us through stories that heal, uplift, and renew your faith. The prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. James 5:16. He didn't kneel for attention. He didn't even kneel out of strength. He knelt because everything else had already fallen. And sometimes, that's when heaven begins to whisper. The morning sky bled into a dull gray as Daniel stepped out onto the cracked porch. His hands, rough from years of labor, trembled slightly as he reached for the brim of his hat. The air smelled of soil and silence, a silence that had lingered for months across the land. The corn never broke the surface. The wheat dried before it could speak. And now, his heart echoed that same stillness. Empty rows, broken rows, promises that never bloomed. In the distance, the old scarecrow swayed lifelessly. It had once stood proud in the golden light of past seasons. Now it hung like a forgotten prayer, arms stretched as if begging the sky. Daniel looked down at his boots, caked in dust that no rain had washed in nearly 6 weeks. His father had walked these same fields, his grandfather too. They all said, "The land will provide if the Lord is with you." But where was the Lord now? Inside the small kitchen, unopened letters lay stacked on the table. Final warnings, notices, names of banks and deadlines. His wife, Hannah, used to read them aloud, but since she passed, he only glanced at the dates. He didn't need to know the words. He already felt them pressing against his chest every time he laid down, alone, defeated, afraid to pray again because silence had become too familiar. His fingers traced the edge of a photo on the wall. A young Daniel with his father, both holding shovels, both smiling in sunlight. There was a strength in those eyes that he no longer recognized in the mirror. What do you do when faith becomes memory? When every harvest is a prayer unanswered? When the barn is full of tools, but the heart is too tired to lift them? By noon, the sun had vanished behind thick clouds. A wind picked up, not harsh, but expectant. The kind of wind that didn't bring rain, just more waiting. Daniel walked the property line slowly, boots dragging, head low. With every step, he whispered the names of those he lost. Hannah, Caleb, the farmhands who'd left for better towns. Each name, a seed he never got to plant again. He paused at the northern edge, where the fence had collapsed last winter. The soil here was darker, untouched. He knelt, not to pray yet, but just to feel the earth. It was still warm, still breathing, and that confused him. How could something that looked so dead still hold life beneath the surface? A single drop of rain fell on the back of his neck, then another. It was the kind of rain that didn't rush. It tapped gently like someone knocking from heaven. He looked up. No thunder, no lightning, just gray clouds weeping over forgotten land. For a moment, he wanted to believe it was just weather, but something stirred inside him. Daniel removed his hat, pressed his palms into the soil, and for the first time in months, spoke aloud. "Lord, I don't even know what to ask for anymore, but I'm still here, and I still believe you are too." The stack of unopened letters sat like a quiet accusation on the edge of the kitchen table. The envelopes had changed colors slightly with time, some yellowing, some curling at the corners, but Daniel never threw them away. He couldn't. Each one felt like a record of failure, a confirmation that things had slipped beyond control. He didn't need to read the words to feel what they carried. Deadlines, debts, and reminders that the world had moved on without mercy. Every morning, he would pass by them like someone avoiding the eyes of a stranger. And yet this morning was different. After kneeling in the rain, something subtle had shifted. Not in the sky, not even in the farm, but inside him. As he poured his coffee, his gaze lingered on the top envelope longer than usual. It was addressed in neat handwriting, with the logo of the local bank in the corner. He reached out, hesitated, then pulled his hand back. Instead of opening it, he went to the drawer near the sink and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. It was Hannah's prayer journal, worn, cracked at the edges, pages smudged from both ink and tears. She had written in it almost daily, even when her hands grew weak from illness. Daniel opened to a random page. Her handwriting was soft, slanted. The entry read, "Lord, if Daniel forgets how to speak to you, speak to him through the rain." He sat down slowly. That line hit him like a voice he hadn't heard in years. Could she have known? That one day he would stop praying, stop believing, stop trying. He ran his fingers over the ink, almost afraid to touch it. The words were old, but alive. And in that moment he realized maybe the letters on the table weren't the only ones that had been ignored. Maybe God had been sending his own, through Hannah, through the wind, through the silence. He flipped through more pages, prayers for the harvest, for the neighbors, for Daniel's heart not to harden. And at the back, folded neatly, was a small envelope. No address, just his name in Hannah's handwriting. His chest tightened. He hadn't seen this before. With shaking hands, he opened it. Inside was a short note. If the land ever fails you, let it push you to your knees. Not to give up, but to remember who gave it to you. He leaned back in the chair, holding the note to his chest. It felt heavier than it should. The house was silent, but his soul was loud, flooded with memories of Hannah reading scriptures aloud while dinner simmered on the stove, of her humming hymns as she folded laundry, of her belief in a God she saw in every corner of that farm. She was gone, but her faith had not been buried with her. Daniel stood and walked back to the table. This time he picked up the bank letter and opened it. As expected, it was a final notice. They would repossess the land in 28 days, but something inside him didn't flinch, not like before. He folded the paper calmly and set it beside Hannah's note. Two voices, one shouting fear, the other whispering faith. And for the first time in months, he chose which one to listen to. He walked to the front door and stepped outside. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still heavy. Not with threat, but with promise. He looked over the fields again. Nothing had changed. Yet. But he had. And in the quiet between heartbeats, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Not hope, not strength, but the beginning of both. It began with a soft rhythm on the tin roof, barely noticeable at first. Daniel sat on the porch steps, arms resting on his knees, watching the horizon blur into shades of gray. The fields stretched ahead like a forgotten canvas, thirsty for grace. The drops fell slower than before, but steadier. It wasn't a storm. It wasn't a drizzle. It was something in between, a persistence, like a whisper that refused to be silenced. He could smell it now, the mix of dust turning into mud, the wooden beams breathing with moisture, the scent of something ancient being awakened. The wind moved gently, brushing his cheeks with fingers colder than usual. He hadn't seen rain last this long in weeks. His neighbors would call it coincidence, maybe luck. But Daniel had a different word rising quietly in his chest: mercy. Inside, the radio remained silent, the house still untouched. But outside, something was moving. Tiny rivulets began to form in the furrows of the field, like veins in the earth reopening. The scarecrow, soaked and tilting, looked almost alive, arms lifted not in warning, but surrender. Daniel took a slow breath and closed his eyes, letting the rain fall freely on his face, baptizing the doubt off his skin. He remembered a verse Hannah once repeated: "Let my teaching fall like rain and my words descend like dew." He never understood it until now. Sometimes, what you need doesn't come as thunder or fire, but as drops that refuse to stop falling. He stood up, slowly, boots sinking into the softening ground, and began to walk toward the center of the field without knowing why. Each step was heavier, not from mud, but meaning. The soil held him differently now, not as a burden, but as if it remembered him. He passed the row where he and Hannah once planted marigolds for the first time. He hadn't noticed how much life still clung to the edges, small weeds, unnoticed sprouts, green struggling beneath brown. Life doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits to be noticed. He knelt again, this time not out of desperation, but reverence. The rain tapped against his shoulders, steady and patient. He didn't speak immediately. There were no grand words, no declarations of surrender, just breath, just presence. And then quietly, he said, "Thank you for not forgetting me." In that moment, a breeze swept across the field, brushing through the rows with a sound like rustling pages. Daniel looked up, startled. A figure stood at the far edge of the land, small, unmoving, cloaked in gray. For a heartbeat, he thought it was his imagination. But then the figure raised a hand, slowly, and waved. Daniel rose, eyes fixed on the silhouette. His pulse quickened, not from fear, but a strange familiarity he couldn't place. The rain continued as if shielding something sacred. He took a hesitant step forward, unaware that this moment, this figure, would be the turning point of everything he thought he understood about faith, strangers, and answered prayer. Daniel stood still, heart pounding like hooves on dry ground. The figure at the far edge of the field remained motionless, shrouded in mist and rain. It wasn't close enough to recognize, but not so far that it felt unreal. Every instinct told him to stay where he was, to question what his eyes were seeing. But something deeper pulled him forward, not curiosity, not fear. It was something older, like recognition. He stepped carefully through the field, his boots slipping slightly in the wet soil. The figure remained, hand still raised. Daniel's breath quickened. The last time someone waved from that side of the land was the day his son left, young, angry, desperate to escape the weight of inheritance. That was years ago. Could it be? No. He shook the thought away. This wasn't memory. This was something else. Something present. Halfway across the field, the rain grew heavier, but Daniel didn't stop. The mud clung to his boots, but it didn't feel like resistance. It felt like the land didn't want to let go. He finally reached the spot, but the figure was gone. The space stood empty. No footprints, no trace. Only the soft echo of the rain hitting earth, and the lingering sense that something sacred had just passed through. He turned slowly, looking across the acres, trying to make sense of what he'd felt. Then he noticed it, directly beneath where the figure had stood, a single flower blooming through the soil. It was out of season, out of place, a wild violet, delicate and defiant. Daniel knelt before it instinctively, his hand hovering above the petals. How had it survived the drought? How had it pushed through? He didn't need answers. Not then. For the first time, he realized faith wasn't always loud or logical. Sometimes faith looked like waiting in silence. Sometimes it looked like kneeling in mud for no reason other than the belief that something good could still grow. He bowed his head and whispered, "Lord, you don't need to move mountains. Just move me." The wind responded like a breath, moving through the wheat stubs in a wave. He felt warmth on his back, not from the sun, but from within, like something had awakened. The rain still fell, but no longer felt like grief. It felt like washing, like returning. Daniel stayed there, on his knees, not to beg, but to align. In the stillness, he remembered something his grandfather used to say, "Kneeling doesn't make you weak, it makes you ready." Daniel let the words sink in. Maybe he hadn't lost his faith. Maybe it had just been waiting here, buried in the same soil as his sorrow. Behind him, the barn door creaked open. A voice called from the porch, deep, unfamiliar, but clear. "Sir, You don't know me, but I think I'm here for you." Daniel turned toward the voice, rising slowly from the muddy ground. The barn door creaked again, pushed by the wind or by the hand of the stranger who stood beneath its frame. He was young, mid-20s maybe, dressed in soaked jeans and a navy coat, the kind worn by men who worked with their hands. His hair was drenched, his eyes wide with a strange mix of fear and resolve. He stepped forward carefully, as if not wanting to startle the land itself. "I saw you kneeling," the young man said, voice unsteady. "Didn't mean to interrupt." Daniel nodded silently, unsure whether to speak or listen. The man looked over the fields, his hands stuffed into his coat pockets. "My name's Eli. I've been walking for hours. Something told me to come this way." The rain had slowed now, turning into mist. A deep rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, far, but close enough to feel in the chest. Daniel studied him carefully. The boy didn't look like a local, no mud on his boots, no scent of sweat and grain, but there was something about his presence that felt anchored. "You said you're here for me?" Daniel asked, voice hoarse. Eli nodded, pulling out a folded paper from his coat. It was damp, but intact. He handed it to Daniel. "I found this in an old Bible I bought at a thrift store in the next town. It had your name written on the inside cover." Daniel unfolded the page. His eyes widened. It was Hannah's handwriting, the same delicate curves, the same ink color. At the top, in faded blue letters, "To whoever finds this, you're not lost. You're the answer to someone else's prayer." Below that, a list of verses, and his name. Thunder rolled again, closer this time. Daniel swallowed hard. The wind picked up, circling them like a breath held too long. How could this boy have found that Bible? How had it traveled? Eli looked down, almost apologetic. "I don't know who she was, but I couldn't shake it. Every time I tried to leave town, something stopped me. I felt like I needed to find you. I didn't even know if you were real." Daniel stepped back, clutching the paper. The air around him buzzed, not with fear, but with revelation. This wasn't coincidence, this was orchestration, a whisper through thunder. The boy continued, "I'm not a preacher. I'm not even sure what I believe most days, but something told me I was part of something bigger here. And then I saw you out there in the field, praying like it was your last hope." Daniel looked at him, seeing not just a stranger, but a thread in the tapestry of something divine. Perhaps God didn't send answers in lightning bolts. Maybe he sent them in soaked coats and thrift store Bibles. They stood there in silence as the first real crack of thunder split the sky. A flash of lightning followed, bright enough to illuminate the entire field for a second. In that moment, Daniel saw not destruction, but renewal. The storm wasn't to break him. It was to break something open, something buried, something ready. Then Eli asked, voice barely above a whisper, "Do you believe she knew I'd find it?" Daniel looked down at the page again, trembling. She didn't have to know. She just had to believe someone would. The rain slowed to a fine mist, almost reverent, as if the storm itself recognized the holiness of the moment. Daniel and Eli walked side by side toward the barn, silence stretching between them like thread pulled tight. The muddy ground sucked at their boots, but neither seemed in a hurry. The paper in Daniel's hand fluttered with each breeze, fragile yet unshaken, like faith reborn. Eli glanced at it again, still visibly unsure whether he was part of a miracle or a mistake. Inside the barn, the air smelled of old hay and rusted iron. Patches of light filtered through warped wood panels, casting golden beams across forgotten tools and empty feed barrels. Daniel motioned for Eli to sit on a bale of straw while he lit the small lantern that still hung near the entrance. The flame danced to life slowly, illuminating their faces with a glow that made the dust sparkle like stars in the darkness. "This farm's all I have," Daniel said finally, voice low. and even that's slipping away. Eli nodded, pulling a crumpled notebook from his coat. I've never stayed anywhere more than a few weeks, he admitted. But when I read that note, I felt like maybe I was meant to stop running. He opened the notebook and flipped to a page filled with scripture references and short journal entries. I don't know much about planting, about crops, but I know what it's like to feel unseen, to pray and wonder if it even matters. His voice broke on the last word, and he looked down. Daniel watched him closely. The boy didn't come with answers, but maybe that wasn't what he needed. Maybe what God was giving him was presence, witness, connection. Someone to remind him that even strangers can carry seeds of restoration. He took a deep breath and said, "Maybe you're not here to fix anything. Maybe you're just here to help me remember that it's not over yet." The wind outside moaned softly, brushing against the barn walls like a hymn half sung. A drop of water fell from the rafters, landing between them. Eli looked up. "You think she prayed for this?" Daniel nodded slowly. Hannah didn't believe in random. She believed in timing. She believed God sent rain for the soul before he ever sent it for the land. Eli smiled faintly. "Then I guess I'm not lost. Just planted." Those words hit Daniel deeper than he expected. Planted. Not stranded. Not forgotten. Planted. He thought of all the things buried. Dreams, prayers, love. Things that don't disappear. They just wait for the right season. Maybe Eli was part of that season. Maybe the harvest he feared had failed was only beginning underground. Eli stood up and walked to the barn door. The mist had returned, painting the fields with silver. "You ever wonder," he asked, "if the reason God takes so long to answer is because he's waiting for us to be ready to listen?" Daniel joined him at the doorway, eyes scanning the horizon. "I used to think he was silent, but now I think I was just too loud to hear him." Suddenly, headlights appeared at the edge of the dirt road. A truck rolled to a slow stop just outside the property. No one was expected. No one should have known where they were. Eli and Daniel exchanged a glance. Their bodies still. The engine shut off. The driver's door creaked open, and out stepped a woman, wearing a weathered brown coat, holding a letter in her hand, looking straight at Daniel. Daniel stepped forward slowly, eyes locked on the woman approaching through the rain-kissed fog. Her coat was too thin for the weather, her boots worn at the soles, but she walked with purpose. In her right hand, a letter, creased and fragile. Her hair clung to her face, darkened by mist, and her expression was unreadable. Not afraid, not eager, just steady. Eli moved beside Daniel, unsure whether to speak, but something told them both to wait. As she came closer, Daniel's breath caught. There was something hauntingly familiar about her presence, something that lived between memory and revelation. The woman paused a few feet away, lifting the envelope. "I was told to bring this to you," she said softly. "I didn't know why, but something in me said, don't let it stay unread." Her voice carried an accent Daniel couldn't place, warm and tremulous like a hymn barely remembered. He took the letter with careful hands. The paper was damp, the ink smudged but still legible. On the front, his name. Inside, a single page. As he unfolded it, the words stared back at him. Handwritten, unmistakable. Hannah's script again, but not from the journal. This was different. This was dated a week before her death. At the top, it read, "If this finds you when the land is empty, remember that seeds are buried, not lost." Daniel read silently, his hands trembling. The letter spoke of sorrow, of patience, of a harvest unseen. She wrote of someone coming, not to replace what was lost, but to awaken what still lived. She mentioned no names, only feelings, a stirring in the soul, a stranger sent not by man but by mercy. His knees buckled slightly as the words reached the end. "When rain returns, so will life. Build shelter, not for what has grown, but for what is about to." He looked up at the woman, eyes glassy. "Where did you get this?" She smiled faintly, her eyes soft with something like peace. It was mailed to the church I clean in the next town. No return address, just your name and the words, "Deliver when the field is wet." Daniel's breath shook as he nodded slowly. This wasn't a letter. It was prophecy, and it had arrived in the exact hour it was needed. Eli stood stunned, watching everything unfold like pages in a divine script. He reached for the barn door and pulled it wider. "Bring her in," he said gently. No seed grows in the open. Inside, the air was warmer now, the lantern still glowing. Daniel led the woman in, giving her a chair and a blanket from a nearby crate. No one rushed. No one explained. They just sat, three souls in a holy pause, as the rain continued to kiss the roof above them. The letter lay on the table between them. Eli reached for it with reverence and whispered, "It's not just about crops, is it?" Daniel shook his head. "It never was. It's about preparing the soil, of the heart." Outside, the fields drank deeply. Puddles reflected patches of sky. The scarecrow leaned forward slightly as if bowing in worship. Somewhere beneath the surface, dormant roots stirred from sleep. Daniel stood and walked to the far wall of the barn, where old wooden boards leaned against the back. He pulled them down one by one, revealing a corner he hadn't touched in years. Beneath a dusty tarp lay lumber, tools, and a blueprint he once designed with Hannah, a shelter for seedlings, a space to start again. He turned toward the others, eyes burning with clarity. "It's time to build again," he said. And this time, he wouldn't build it alone. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the world cloaked in silver mist. Daniel awoke early, his body aching from the weight of both work and wonder. The letter from Hannah still lay on the wooden table, pressed flat beneath a small glass jar to keep it safe from the breeze sneaking through the cracks of the barn. As he stared at the handwriting, he felt both comfort and unease. There was something about her words, something unfinished, that kept tugging at his thoughts. Eli was already awake, sitting on the barn steps, looking out over the damp field. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted when Daniel approached. "Something about that letter. It feels like it's part of a bigger story we don't see yet." Daniel nodded silently, his fingers brushing the brim of his hat. The woman from the church was still asleep inside, wrapped in an old quilt. Her presence, though quiet, carried a mystery that Daniel couldn't shake. Who sent her here? Why now? Daniel decided to read the letter again, this time aloud. The words floated into the barn, soft but steady. "If the land feels empty, let your faith plant what your hands cannot. And if a stranger comes, do not fear. They are often answers disguised as questions." The more he read, the more he realized. This wasn't a letter written for him alone. It spoke of something larger, something beyond his farm, beyond his grief. As he turned the letter over, a faint smudge on the back caught his attention. It wasn't Hannah's handwriting. It was something else, almost like initials or a signature barely legible under water stains. He brought it closer to the lantern light and saw the letters, J.M. Daniel frowned. "These aren't Hannah's initials," he muttered. "This wasn't just for me." The air in the barn seemed to tighten, as if holding its breath. Eli leaned in, curiosity burning in his eyes. "Maybe it was meant for someone else, too," he suggested. "Someone connected to you, or to this land." Daniel thought about his father's journals, about the stories he never finished telling. Could this letter have roots in a promise made generations ago? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. Perhaps Hannah had uncovered something bigger before she passed. The woman stirred from her sleep and sat up slowly, pulling the quilt around her shoulders. "Is everything all right?" she asked softly. Daniel hesitated, then handed her the letter. She read it carefully, her eyes widening as she reached the end. "I've seen these initials before," she whispered, "in the church archives where I work. They belong to a man who donated the very Bible where I found this note." The barn grew silent. Daniel's heart raced. "Who was he?" She looked up, her face pale but resolute. His name was Jacob Miller, a preacher. He vanished decades ago, but he left behind letters and prayers, written for the people he believed would carry on his faith. Daniel felt the ground shift beneath his feet. This wasn't just Hannah's message. It was part of a legacy reaching beyond time. A low rumble of thunder rolled across the distant hills, even though the sky was clearing. It sounded less like warning and more like a voice, deep, echoing, calling them forward. Daniel tightened his grip on the letter. "Then we're not just rebuilding a farm," he said. "We're finishing something that started long before us." And in that moment, he knew the next step would change everything. The morning air carried the scent of wet earth and wood smoke, wrapping the farm in a hush that felt sacred. Daniel stood beneath the old oak near the barn, his fingers tracing the edge of the letter now carefully placed in a plastic sleeve. The initials J.M. echoed in his thoughts, woven now with Hannah's words, Eli's arrival, and the stranger's unexpected visit. The more pieces came together, the more he felt that none of this was chance. It was design. God had been speaking, just not in the ways Daniel expected. Eli hammered the last board into place on the seed shelter they'd begun rebuilding the day before. The small structure wasn't much, but it was strong. Clean lines, fresh wood, and open space to start again. As he stepped back to admire their work, Daniel approached with a quiet reverence. "She drew this," Daniel said, holding out the old blueprint. "Every beam, every shelf. She saw it before any of us could." Eli smiled softly. "Faith always sees what's not there yet." The woman, whose name they now knew was Miriam, had begun organizing the notes, scriptures, and journals Daniel had stored away after Hannah's passing. She created a corner of the barn that looked more like a chapel now. Candles, verses pinned to the wall, and a Bible left open in the center. She never spoke much, but everything she touched radiated peace, as if her purpose wasn't to explain, but to prepare the ground for what heaven was planting. That afternoon, as clouds drifted and birds returned, a letter arrived, not by mail truck, but hand-delivered by a quiet man on horseback from the neighboring town. He handed it to Daniel, tipped his hat, and rode off without a word. Inside was a legal document, a clause Daniel had never seen, hidden deep within the bank agreement, a forgotten trust, signed years ago by Jacob Miller himself, granting grace to any farmer still working the land with faith and no heirs. Daniel qualified by grace. He sat on the porch, stunned. No more repossession, no more threats. The land was safe, not through money or deals, but by a signature long buried and a faith long sown. Miriam stood behind him, her hands folded. "Heaven doesn't always shout," she said gently. "Sometimes it whispers through old ink and strangers who listen." Daniel felt the truth of her words settle deep in his bones. It was quiet, but it was an answer. As evening fell, Daniel walked the rows of earth once more. He didn't look for signs this time. He simply looked with gratitude. Every drop of rain that had fallen, every tear he'd shed, every silence he had mistaken for absence. It all led here, to a harvest not measured in crops, but in conviction, not in yield, but in yielded hearts. In the distance, Eli played a hymn on an old harmonica they found in a dusty crate. The notes floated across the land like a lullaby to the soil. Daniel closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he didn't pray with desperation. He prayed with calm. "Thank you for what you gave, and thank you for what you took, so I could hear you again." As the stars blinked into the night sky, a gentle wind swept across the field, bending the smallest sprouts now pushing through the surface. They weren't strong yet, but they were alive, and heaven was no longer silent. Morning light poured over the hills like liquid gold, stretching across the land that had once been silent. Now it breathed. Daniel stood at the edge of the field, boots damp with dew, watching new shoots pierce through the soil like soft declarations of life. They weren't uniform, they weren't plentiful, but they were enough. His chest rose slowly, rhythm steady, hands calm by his sides. The burden he once carried had shifted, not because it disappeared, but because it was now shared with heaven. Eli approached from behind, a steaming mug in each hand. "You were out here early," he said, handing one to Daniel. "Didn't want to miss the first true morning of spring," Daniel replied with a smile. The boy grinned, eyes still carrying that mixture of wonder and humility. "You ever think maybe the ground was waiting for you too?" Daniel sipped slowly, eyes locked on the rows ahead. "Maybe it wasn't the land that was dry. Maybe it was me." Inside the barn, Miriam knelt beside the makeshift altar she had gently constructed. A candle flickered softly beside the Bible, opened now to Isaiah. She prayed not in grand words, but in silence, a prayer of thanks, a prayer of continuation. On the wall behind her, the original blueprint for the seed shelter hung, framed between two faded photos, one of Daniel and Hannah, the other, Jacob Miller, standing beside a cross. Legacy, preserved not by fame, but by faith. Daniel entered quietly and stood near the photos. "Funny," he said, voice hushed. "I used to think harvest was all about gathering, but sometimes it's just about seeing." Miriam turned, her face soft with peace. "And sometimes," she added, "God lets the seeds die, just so he can bring life out of the ground we stopped believing in." He nodded. Her words were true. He had buried more than crops in that land. He had buried grief, guilt, hope, and now, one by one, they were blooming. Later that afternoon, they held a small gathering in the open shelter. No invitation sent, just word of mouth. Neighbors came, strangers came. One by one, they filled the benches, drawn by something they couldn't name. No pulpit, no sermon, just testimonies. Daniel shared his story, not as a man who triumphed, but as one who surrendered. He spoke of rain, letters, strangers, and how God didn't save the land until he had reached the soul first. As the sun began to lower, Daniel stepped into the field alone one last time. The earth beneath him was no longer hostile. It welcomed him like an old friend. He walked slowly between the rows, fingertips grazing the tender leaves. He wasn't measuring success. He was remembering every tear that had fallen here, each one now part of something new. Those who sow with tears will reap with songs of joy. Psalm 126:5 NIV. He looked toward the sky, now painted in soft hues of orange and violet. "You kept every word," he whispered, "even the ones I never had the courage to say out loud." A gentle breeze moved through the field, lifting his hat slightly. He closed his eyes, letting the moment settle into his bones like rain into soil. The harvest wasn't grand, but it was sacred. As he turned back toward the shelter, he saw them waiting. Eli, Miriam, and others. A small community, a field no longer forgotten, a man no longer lost. And above them, the heavens watched in silence. Not because God wasn't speaking, but because sometimes silence is the sound of every prayer being answered. He will yet fill your mouth with laughter and your lips with shouts of joy. Job 8:21.